Proverbs for Beginners, Practical Wisdom for the Everyday Life. That's the name of the series that we're doing. This is lesson number 3 in that series, and the title of today's lesson is Hebrew Poetry and a Life of Righteousness and Fear of the Lord, Proverbs chapter 10 to chapter 18. So let's begin with some information about Hebrew poetry itself, and Hebrew poetry that appears in the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs is a part of the wisdom literature of the Bible and is written primarily in the Hebrew poetry style, which is a distinctive literary form that communicates profound truths in a concise and memorable way. And so understanding the features of Hebrew poetry can enrich our study of Proverbs, as these various techniques are used to emphasize or to clarify or to enhance the teaching of wisdom. We begin with one technique, if you wish, one feature of Hebrew poetry, which is called parallelism. Parallelism is the hallmark of Hebrew poetry. It involves a relationship between two or more lines that work together to convey a particular message. In Proverbs, this feature enhances meaning and makes the sayings more memorable. Now, there are several types of parallelism. For example, there is synonymous parallelism. This is where the second line restates the first line, but in different words. I'll give you an example, Proverbs 19, verse 5. A false witness will not go unpunished, and one who declares lies will not escape. So here, the second line reinforces the idea in the first line using synonymous phrases. So it's not the same words, and it's not rhyme scheme. There's no rhyme scheme in Hebrew poetry. The idea is it's the rhyming of ideas and the rhyming of thoughts from one line to the other. That's why they call it parallelism. Another type is antithetical parallelism. Here, the second line contrasts with the first, highlighting opposites in order to create a vivid comparison. Our example, Proverbs chapter 10, verse 1, a wise son makes a father glad, but a foolish son is a grief to his mother. So this contrast emphasizes the impact of wisdom and folly on family relationships. Another type of parallelism is synthetic parallelism. Here, the second line builds or expands the idea in the first line. So Proverbs 3, verse 6 is an example of this. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight. So we see here the second line completes the thought by describing the outcome of submission to God. So if you acknowledge God and you acknowledge Him, that's your submission to God, well, He will make your paths straight. There's the result there, expanding the idea in the first line. Another technique is, aside from parallelism, is imagery and metaphor. Hebrew poetry often uses vivid imagery and metaphor in order to convey truths in a way that resonates with the reader. These figures of speech connect abstract ideas to concrete experiences. For example, in Proverbs 25:11, like apples of gold and settings of silver is a word spoken at the proper time. So here this metaphor compares a wise and appropriate word to something which is beautiful and valuable. Another example, Proverbs 6:6, example of imagery. Go to the ant, you lazy one, observe its ways and be wise. So here the imagery of the diligent ant highlights the importance and the rewards of hard work. Another technique, another feature of Hebrew poetry is brevity and pithiness. Hebrew poetry in Proverbs is concise, often delivering profound truths in just a few words. This brevity aids memorization, and it forces the reader to reflect deeply on the meaning. And so we read in Proverbs 15, verse 1, "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." So here, the short, contrasting lines pack a powerful lesson about the impact of words. Another technique is repetition. Repetition is used for emphasis and reinforcement, ensuring that the key ideas are not missed. Example, Proverbs 4, verse 7, "The beginning of wisdom is acquire wisdom, and with all your possessions acquire understanding." And so we see the repeated command to get and to acquire wisdom highlights its supreme value. One other technique we'll look at is personification. Proverbs frequently personifies wisdom and folly, portraying them as women who invite people to follow their paths. This technique makes abstract concepts more relatable and engaging. Again, examples, Proverbs 9, verse 1, "Wisdom has built her house. She has carved out her 7 pillars." And so here wisdom is personified as a hostess, preparing a banquet, inviting others to partake in her teachings. Proverbs 9:13, "The foolish woman, a woman of foolishness is boisterous. She has a lack of understanding and knows nothing." And so folly is personified as a loud and ignorant woman, contrasting sharply with the personification of the wise woman. And so the poetic structure of Proverbs is not just a stylistic choice, it serves a practical purpose. Parallelism aids in understanding and retention. Imagery makes abstract truths tangible. And personification invites readers to engage with wisdom and folly as if they were real characters. Together, these features make the teaching of Proverbs timeless, applicable, and deeply impactful. By appreciating these poetic elements, we can better grasp the richness of Proverbs and apply its wisdom to our everyday lives. I want to continue with other forms of parallelism in Hebrew poetry, not used as often and yet still providing impact for the reader when the writer is using these techniques. So we have climactic parallelism, or some call it step parallelism. This type of parallelism builds intensity or adds more detail with each successive line. And so the second line completes or reinforces the thought of the first line, but also introduces repetition for emphasis. So again, an example, Psalm 29, verses 1 and 2. "Ascribe to the Lord, sons of the mighty. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due to His name. Worship the Lord in holy attire." And so each line here repeats the call to ascribe to the Lord with increasing focus on worship and God's majesty. And so the stair-step effect, adding in order to make a stronger impact with the idea contained in the poem. Another type is emblematic parallelism. Here in emblematic parallelism, one line contains a metaphor or a simile, and the other explains and elaborates it. So the example I've chosen is Psalms 42, verse 1. "As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God." And so the image of the thirsty deer illustrates the psalmist's longing for God. Emblematic parallelism. Another type is chiastic parallelism. Chiastic parallelism arranges lines in a A-B-B-A structure, where the first and the last lines correspond to each other, and the two middle lines are a related pair. So this structure often highlights the central idea. So We look at Psalm 124, verse 7. Our soul has escaped as a bird out of the snare of the trapper. The snare is broken and we have escaped. You see the A, B, B, A. Our soul has escaped as a bird. There's A at the bottom, and we have escaped. So there's A and A. And then the middle lines, out of the snare of the trapper, the snare is broken. There's B, B, okay? So the escape theme frames the lines, drawing attention to the psalmist's central message of deliverance. Another type of parallelism is formal parallelism. In formal parallelism, the relationship between the lines is loose, with no obvious semantic or grammatical connection, but the second line still complements the first. Example, Psalm 2, verse 6, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. And so the second line does not directly restate or contrast the first, but it elaborates on the king's installation by specifying the location where this has taken place. Inverted parallelism or mirror-like parallelism is the next type. Inverted parallelism, the order of elements in the first line is reversed in the second line, creating a mirror-like structure. So example, Psalm 30, verse 11, you turned my wailing into dancing, you removed my sackcloth and clothed me with joy. So the reversal highlights the transformation from sorrow to joy. You turned my wailing into dancing, you removed my sackcloth and clothed me with joy. Two things saying the same thing at the same beat, but using different words and ideas. And then there's comparative parallelism. Here, one line presents a comparison or an analogy, and the other offers the main idea or conclusion based on that analogy. So example, Psalm 103, verse 13. Just as a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. So you see the analogy of a compassionate father clarifies God's loving nature. They're compared to each other. Father's love, God's love gives us a deeper understanding of God's loving nature. And then there's something called acrostic structure. It's not parallelism, but it's a technique used in Hebrew poetry. Acrostic poetry uses the structure of Hebrew letters, for example in Psalm 119. So it uses Hebrew letters to create patterned parallels. So each section begins with a consecutive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. That's what acrostic is. You go through the alphabet and each line or each section, it depends which it is, begins with the successive letter of the alphabet, whether it's the Hebrew alphabet or even the English alphabet. The first stanza or the first group of lines will start, the first word in that group of lines will start with A. And then in the next section, the first word will start with B. And then in the next section, the first word will start with C, and so on and so forth. That's what an acrostic is. So there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and I'll show you how Hebrew writers used the acrostic method by taking a look at Psalms 119, which is the longest psalm in the book of Psalms. So take a look at the PowerPoint here. So let's say we're going to do Psalm 119. Well, verses 1 to 8 is a section, so it's broken down into every 8 lines. So the first 8 lines, the very first word of the first 8 lines begins with the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph. Then verses 9 to 16, the next 8 lines, begins with the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Beth. And then verses 17 to 24, the next 8 lines, the first word in those 8 lines begins with the 3rd letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and so on and so forth. I didn't have room in my PowerPoint to kind of list all of this, but if you just keep going down to the very end of that poem, of that section, so you'll have Psalm 119, the last 8 lines, 169 to 176. The first word in those last 8 lines begins with the last letter in the Hebrew alphabet, which is Tav. And so you have one successive letter for each line. There are 22 letters. 8 times 22, 176. Well, Psalms has 176 verses. An excellent example of the use of acrostic poetry in the book of Psalms. So these additional forms of parallelism demonstrate the literary depth and beauty of Hebrew poetry. They enable the writers of Psalms and Proverbs and other wisdom literature to convey profound truths with variety, creativity, and emphasis. Understanding these poetic structures allows readers to appreciate the richness of the biblical text, and it enhances personal study and reflection. So Hebrew poetry contrasts and manipulate thoughts and ideas and not just words. In Western poetry, not all poetry, but in a lot of Western poetry, the key technique is rhyme, that we rhyme words and so on and so forth. In Hebrew poetry, it's the rhyming of ideas. It's the contrasting of thoughts and not necessarily the words themselves that sound the same. That's one of the big differences between Hebrew poetry and Western or more modern type poetry. So in our previous 2 lessons, we covered chapters 1 to 9 that dealt primarily with the subject of wisdom. We first considered the general theme of wisdom found in Hebrew writings, especially in the book of Proverbs. We considered the various themes found in Proverbs and the connection of this book to the teachings of Jesus. We did that in our last lesson. We also reviewed the standard questions associated with the critical introduction of any book of the Bible. Things like the author, the date of the writing of the book, the occasion of the writing, and its general context. So we covered that material. And in the second lesson of the series, we began a study of the actual content of the book of Proverbs, focusing our attention on the first 9 chapters, which dealt primarily with the call and the personification of the virtue of wisdom itself. We learned about the importance of gaining wisdom and how the author personified wisdom as a woman who called and who sought out those who would acquire the gift that she offered. In today's lesson, we will continue our study of Proverbs by examining the main themes found in the rest of the book, the next of which describes 2 important features of a believer's character: righteousness and fear or respect for the Lord. What does it mean to live a good and meaningful life? Well, the book of Proverbs teaches that the answer lies in righteousness, living according to God's standards, and in the fear of the Lord, which means having a deep respect and trust in the Lord. A godly life is made up of righteousness and fear of the Lord. These 2 principles create a foundation for a life that honors God and brings peace and stability to ourselves as well as other people. And so this lesson will explore what it means to live righteously and to be God-fearing, focusing on how these principles apply to everyday decisions, relationships, as well as challenges. So first I want to talk about righteousness and wickedness. Key passage, Proverbs 10, 1 to 12, and 11, 1 to 10. Proverbs contrasts the outcomes of righteous and wicked living. Righteousness is marked by honesty, kindness, and integrity, while wickedness leads to harm and instability. And so one of the Proverbs mentioned, Proverbs 10 verse 11 says, The mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. And then in Proverbs 11:1, Solomon writes, a false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. And so you have two examples of antithetical parallelism here contrasting, first line, second line being contrasted. But the point of these two is that living righteously means doing what's right, even when it's inconvenient or unnoticed. It's about being honest in your work and fair in your dealings and kind in your relationships. For example, choosing to report an error at work even if it's in your favor, because integrity matters more than short-term gain. So this is more on the theme of righteousness and fear of the Lord. Another example, the rewards of fearing the Lord. Key passages in 14:26 and 7 and 15:13. And so the fear of the Lord, a deep respect and trust in God, this is the foundation of wisdom and security. It leads to a stable life and a healthy understanding of humility. So the two passages we've chosen, in the fear of the Lord there is strong confidence, and His children will have refuge, Proverbs 14:26. And then the fear of the Lord is the instruction for wisdom, and before honor comes humility. Two examples here, by the way, of synthetic parallelism. In other words, both of them meaning somewhat the same thing. Trusting God above all else brings peace and clarity, especially in uncertain times. As the writers mention here, humility as a product of fearing the Lord opens the door to growth and respect. So an example, when facing a tough decision, we should pause and ask ourselves, what decision aligns with God's principles? In other words, choosing God's way, even if it's not the easiest path, this eventually leads to long-term peace. Another example, practical righteousness in relationships and behavior. Righteousness extends to how we treat other people. Proverbs highlights the importance of being trustworthy and kind and a source of peace. We read in Proverbs chapter 10, verse 12, hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all offenses. And then in Proverbs 11:11, by the blessing of the upright a city is exalted, but by the mouth of the wicked it is torn down. So in the first one, 10:12, that's an example of antithetical parallelism, a contrast. In Proverbs 11:11, again, a repeat, antithetical parallelism, a contrast. Our actions, these two proverbs are telling us, our actions and words have a ripple effect. Choosing to be patient, forgiving, and encouraging builds stronger relationship, and it benefits the community. For example, responding to a heated argument with calm words instead of anger preserves the relationship instead of escalating the conflict or winning the argument. Sometimes people, all they want to do is win the argument. Well, sometimes you win the argument, but you lose the battle, or you win the argument, you lose your friend. And so what Solomon is writing here is showing us are signs and actions of the wise person. This is what the wise person does. So some questions here that might be asked based on some of the things that we've read. First question, what does fearing the Lord mean? Well, it's not about being scared of God, but rather respecting His wisdom and authority. It's trusting that His way is always the best way, and when it's hard to see in the moment, it's still the best way. For example, trusting God's timing when a prayer isn't answered right away, or seeking His guidance when you're making a difficult decision. All of these actions, all of these intentions display wisdom, spiritual wisdom, as James says, wisdom from above rather than wisdom from below. Another question, how does righteousness shape our daily lives? Well, righteousness influences how we work, how we speak, and interact with other people. It's the practical outworking of faith in everyday actions. A righteous person just doesn't wake up righteous. It's something you learn, it's something you practice, it's something you grow into. But there are definite markers when a person is practicing righteousness. Peace in his or her own life, better relationships with other people, a peace that we have with God. We know that God is blessing our lives. Being honest in small decisions, such as returning the extra change that you got at the grocery store, or being generous with your time by helping a neighbor in need. This is the outworking of our righteousness. Righteousness is not just displayed while we're at a church service, but more importantly displayed in our everyday lives as we interact with our neighbors and friends and co-workers. Some practical applications for everyday living. For those who want to practice righteousness and fear of the Lord, there are some practical things that we can do that will help develop those spiritual qualities within us. Here are a couple. Commit to integrity. In other words, be honest and fair in your dealings, yes, whether you're in the workplace or finances or your relationship, but you do it intentionally. I want to be righteous in my dealings with people. I'm committing ahead of time to be a person of integrity. Choose to act with integrity in one specific situation, even if it costs you time or convenience. Another practice, speak words that build up. In other words, avoid gossip and criticism or harshness. Use your words to bring peace and encouragement to other people. Make it a point, for example, to say something kind or uplifting to someone who needs encouragement. Another practice, live with humility and trust in God. Before making decisions, reflect on God's principles and trust His guidance. Write down one decision, for example, that you're facing, and pray for God's wisdom in directing before acting. Try that. We all have decisions. Do I go here? Do I go there? Do I take the job? I not take the job? We all have decisions to make, and not all of them are quite quote moral decisions, like right or wrong morally. Some of them are just, I have to decide what I'm going to do and where I'm going to be. My encouragement is write down the decision that you're facing so it's clarified, and then intentionally pray to God for wisdom and direction before making the decision, before taking action. See how that works. Try that and see how that will work out for you. And so living righteously and fearing the Lord is not about perfection. It's about daily choices that align with God's character and values. These principles lead to a life of stability. Those are the rewards. You're wondering, what does that give me? What do I get if I pursue righteousness and fear of the Lord? Well, these principles lead to a life of stability and peace and blessing, not only for ourselves, but for the people that we interact with on a daily basis. So my closing challenge this week, focus on one area of your life, whether it's work or your relationship or perhaps personal decisions that you have to make, and then intentionally apply the wisdom of Proverbs. In other words, reflect on how righteousness and trusting God will bring practical benefits to your everyday life. By aligning our lives with God's wisdom, we can experience the rewards of living righteously and God-fearing in a world that desperately needs examples of integrity and kindness and humility. In other words, it's an old story, let your light shine. Let your light shine. Sometimes shining your light is not just about quoting Bible passages and going to church and doing those things, but rather living a life where others can see that you're a person of integrity, you're a person of kindness, you're a person that respects God and the things of God. A simple way to let your witness of faith be that of integrity and encouragement and humility. Without a single word about religion or the gospel, others will see that you are different in very important ways that resemble things that are from above and from below. How do people know what are the things that come from above? Well, they see it in us. They see it in believers. They see integrity. They see righteousness and living righteously. They see a deep respect not only for God, but the things of God, worship and the scriptures and the prayer. You know, the things of God are important to a righteous man or a righteous woman. Okay, so those are some thoughts on Proverbs 10 to 18. Our assignment, of course, reread Proverbs 10 to 18, really hopefully be able to grasp. Try to figure out, try to remember when you're quoting these passages in Proverbs, see if you can recognize what type of parallelism is taking place. And then of course, move ahead, read ahead, chapters 19 to 25, we'll be tackling those in our next lesson. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for your attention. We'll see you next time, Lord willing.